Okay, this is the end of a long day. My name is Philippe van Parijs. When I was far less wrinkled than I am now, about 32 years ago, I gathered a few dozen people just a few hundred yards from my home in the university town of Louvain-la-Neuve, and there a little association was created, which you may have heard of. It was called BIEN. Interesting suggestion that was spontaneously made by my friend since then, Guy Standing. And that little association grew and grew. And there we are today. It's still existing after 32 years and thriving thanks to the exceptional commitment of many, many people, not least the current executive committee, the fantastic team of BIEN News, and of course the fantastic organizing committee of this conference, Jürgen, and the whole team, including all the people who've been helping finding these rooms, which have very strange logic in terms of the numbers there. So, before we proceed with the panel, I have to read you part of a little message that was sent to us by the person, if there is one person who did that, who successfully lobbied due to his persistence to turn our little basic income European network into a basic income Earth network. This person we are missing greatly today because it also means that we are going to miss the singing of Blowing in the Wind. Eduardo Suplicy, senator, Brazilian senator until 4 years ago, when he lost his seat at the election when the PT was very low, but he's not here today because he's campaigning very heavily to regain his seat as senator, and there is a good chance that he will, because in his message he mentions that out of the 18 candidates, the election is in a bit more than 1 month, out of the 18 candidates, he's leading with 32%, the second has 18%, and there will be 2 seats of senator allocated in the state of São Paulo. But that is not won yet. Don't. But I'm sure he'll be back at the next Congress to sing. But he's very busy. He says that he has to visit all 645 municipalities in his state, so he can be excused for not being here. And I just read one sentence, which is, I would like to compliment all organizers and participants in the 18th International Congress of BIEN. So that's his message. We are missing another person today, and that is Renana Jabvala, who was initially on the program. She had to have now minor but urgent operation, and Sarath Davala, her compatriot, agreed to step in, and he knows a lot, probably just as much or quasi as much as Renana about what about the Indian experiment. So we are now going to switch to the other slide, which will serve as a background for the whole of our. You don't need to read it all in one go. So we'll first have each of the 5 panelists briefly presenting the experiment in which, in very different ways, they are involved or on which they know a lot. We'll follow that order, so each 2-3 minutes to present it. So we'll start with India, which is more or less a chronological order, including something that will happen in the future. So we'll start with India, then Finland, then the Netherlands, then Ontario, and finally Scotland. So speak into the microphone, which is there. So we start with you, Sarath.
Thank you, Philippe. Considering Philippe said 2-3 minutes, I should make a brief presentation, but considering the size of the population I represent, I think I should get 1 minute more. We are about 1.3 billion people. Well, I was anchoring this pilot project, which happened between 2011 and 13. In 14, the technical report came, and in the same year, we also published a user-friendly book. The pilot gave, I think for all those who already know about it, maybe a repetition, it gave 6,000 individuals for 12 to 18 months. The calculation was just above about 30% of our poverty line, which means we gave about 200 to 300 rupees. What was the motivation? Why did we do this? We did not come originally. It is done by Self-Employed Women's Association, which is a trade union. We came because the welfare delivery was very poor, so we thought cash transfer could be probably a better way of delivering welfare. So that was a simple, practical motive, but I think eventually we have grown into much more serious concept of basic income and trying to understand that and apply to our context. What did we learn from this? What did we expect to learn? We just wanted to see whether welfare delivery is efficient or not. That was a very simple thing we expected. But what we had learned, I have some 5-6 points. When we gave every month to individuals, universal in the village, one village geographically, everybody got it. So psychologically, the first thing that we learned is that when you give basic income every single month for a period of a year and a half, psychologically it provides a certain sense of security. Once that happens, that actually people start making slightly different choices from their what they are from the status quo, and that is when it leads to transformation. And to this transformation, there is a particular emancipatory quality, which means that you see that people know how and they want to get out of their situation, how they want to liberate themselves. So you see that people slowly start moving in that direction, depending on their context and depending on the amount of money we give them. So that was really a revealing for us that majority of people tried to bring some change or the other in 5-6 different domains. I won't go into that. But what is really the cutting edge is giving to individuals as an entitlement and giving every month. Giving every month is really the cutting edge. If you give a lump sum or if you give once in 6 months, I don't know what kind of effect it would have. So the process of change is the cumulative process is the most important. Philippe also asked us the question that would the basic income experiment have any negative consequences, or would it prove that it would be a bad idea? Well,
that we can deal with
later as it comes. Okay. Now, should we do the last bit? That what is my ideal basic income experiment, or we'll come to that? What is the ideal basic income experiment?
We'll come to it later.
Okay,
here
that's
giving an idea of what the experiment was about. And excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sarath. Yeah. So we turn to the local.
Thank you very much. Sarath said that the time for presentation should be related to the number of population, total population. I think that it's a totally wrong statement. Instead, we should take the number of gold medals gotten in Winter Olympics in ski jumping, and that's the proper and totally correct measure. So, the Finnish experiment, everything started in Finland in that way that the center-to-right government that took power 2015, May, it had in its governmental program basic income experiment. And what they wanted to study is if basic income is good for employment, if it's good for elimination of all kind of monetary disincentives that are built in our social security system, and if basic income is good for eliminating all kind of bureaucratic traps. And in the parliamentary discussion, it was expanded because this task that the government gave is pretty limited, and all friends of basic incomes were criticizing that it's too limited a scope. But then they gave us mandate to plan something that also takes into consideration health and well-being aspects. And then they had a tender, and my team happened to win that tender. I don't know if I'm happy with that or not, but here I am. And I was happy with the group of people who were very, very competent, and some of them are here who helped me to plan the experiment. And I don't know if I should say something about the experimental setting or not in this round, or is this enough?
Let's stick to this, and then you can supplement.
Thank you. So that I will have lots of time because of those very many gold medals in ski jumping.
Okay. So thank you. So we move to the Netherlands.
Yeah, welcome. I'm sitting here on behalf of 6 cities in the Netherlands, and they are busy already with experimenting with 3 basic treatments. The first is self-management with exemption treatment, so they have no duties anymore. The second treatment is a tailor-made supervision group. And the third one is, has the label a work pays off group. And although there is some with diversity among the cities, which treatment they do apply. For instance, Utrecht does all 3, but other cities do not all 3. And there's also that some cities do combine these basic treatments. So for instance, there's one city, the city of Groningen, they have one separate weight group that if you are allocated to that group, you can choose yourself which treatment you prefer. Do you understand? So there are 3 basic treatments: exemption, more weight coaching, and allowing more earnings. And Groningen has a treatment that if you are allocated in that treatment, you can choose yourself which of these 3 basic treatments you want. And other cities have other different combinations. Now we do measure in a very broad way, so we do not only focus on the what they call the primary measure of the outflow into paid work, but we also measure health, well-being, life satisfaction, all these kinds of things. And we do also cooperate with each other. So we have a core set of survey questions, and we make sure that these are also used in other type of research, at Eurobarometer questions or other validated instruments of surveys. And we make sure that all these cities use the same surveys so that we can compare at the end the results of the different cities. Now I want to stress that properly, and Robert-Jan van der Veen has written a paper and given a session about this, that this is not a proper basic income experiment, because benefits in the experiment are still household based. So it matters whether you are a single or 2-person households, benefits are still means tested. The experiment is limited to social assistance recipients, so no self-employed or people doing paid work, they are not included, and the earnings that you can keep on top of your benefit is very limited, far below what we wanted. Have I still a minute? Because I have two more things to say.
Yeah, if you can use that minute without anticipating the other questions.
Yeah, okay. So background, because probably in the news media you have heard that many cities in Holland want to do an experiment. And this is because in Holland the provision of social assistance is being decentralized. So the municipalities, they do receive money lump sum, and how much they spend on welfare benefits, on social assistance, is independent from what they get, their budget. So every alderman has an incentive to find a very innovative way to deal in a different way with the people receiving welfare. And it was also in 2015, there was a new act, a participation act, and there was one article which said that if cities want to experiment, there should be room to do so. So many aldermen, they took the opportunity to use this article, famous Article 83, to say we want to find a different way to treat the people relying on welfare. And when we came up with the experiments, with the design, you also have to deliver what they call a policy theory. Why would it work? And the three theories we are using, I will be very briefly, one is inspired by scarcity. There's a book by Shafir and Mani and a very short article in Science, very condensed article, poverty impedes with cognitive function. That was one source of inspiration. The other one is making use of non-standard preferences, such as concerns for reciprocity and fairness. This is relevant for the interaction between the recipients and the caseworker. And the third theory is crowding out theory, that when the municipalities use sanctions and threats, this is not very conducive to make an appeal to the intrinsic motivations of people receiving welfare to behave properly. So that's basically what was going on in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Loek. Can you still see that? Is that clear enough? Or? Yeah. It doesn't seem to light up very, to become sharper. Which one?
The thing in the middle there.
Yeah? Ah, that's better. Okay. So here we just had the two experiments that are ongoing. And so one until the end of this year, the other one until October. And so from the presentation, you realize that in the case of the Netherlands, there are 6 different cities that are involved with very small samples for each of them, because the 2,500 plus 500 control, that for all 6 cities together. And so the Finland experiment has a larger sample. In the case of the Dutch cities also, you've understood that the schemes are different and there are sometimes these options, etc. So it will be far more complex to draw a conclusion from. And so before that we had one experiment that was completed. Perhaps just one word about the legacy survey, which is something that is going on now, and to see what the long-term effects are in one of the... It just finished, yeah? Yeah.
We finished it.
Well, take the microphone and 2 seconds.
Yeah, 4 years later, out of 9 villages, we selected 1 village and went back to see whether the changes we saw actually continued or did not continue. So there are some important changes that continued, and some they have withdrawn. I think the details we can tell later.
And of course, one major difference, which is very visible there, is the level that is, because between the level in India, which went up, that's why you have this little arrow, and it was higher at a later stage in the experiment, it was increased. And then what is similar in the Indian experiment and the Finnish experiment is that it was strictly individual. The amount is the same whether you are cohabiting or whether you are living on your own. But in the Dutch case, as Loek has just said, it's not strictly individual, so you get less if you are in a couple than if you are alone. So we had 1 completed, we had 2 ongoing, and now we have 1 that was cancelled. So
My name's Evelyn Forget. I was an advisor to the previous Ontario government that formulated the project. And I was and still am a member of the evaluation team, which has not yet been informed officially that the experiment has been canceled, although it's all over the press. The evaluation team began our work in September. Ontario was running a standard negative income tax experiment. Some of the decisions about levels and so on were made to make it consistent and to make the integration with other Canadian social programs work. We began recruiting candidates over the summer of 2017. We recruited 6,000 candidates by April 2018 for a full complement of what we'd planned. And the experiment was canceled in July 2018. People started receiving the basic income as soon as they were randomized into treatment or control groups. But as I said, the final registration occurred in April 2018. In terms of data, what we have are baseline surveys, and we hadn't yet gotten to the first annual survey, nor had we negotiated access to the administrative data that we'd planned to use. The intended outcomes, we intended to look at a broad range of health and well-being, educational, and labor market outcomes. Labor market, not so much a reduction in work effort as better matching with jobs and so on. That was what was planned. As it stands, I think no analysis will be possible. Thank you.
Just a word about why it was cancelled.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forget that not everybody is necessarily interested in Canadian provincial politics. This was established by the previous government, which was a Liberal government. There was a provincial election at the beginning of June, and during the election campaign, all provincial parties committed themselves to the continuation of the experiment, including the Progressive Conservative government, which won the election. A month later, they changed their mind. The initial announcement said that the experiment was canceled because it was a manifest failure. Since there was no data, it wasn't clear how that conclusion was drawn. The next day, the minister said it was canceled because it was unsustainable. The costs were too high. It was $50 million a year gross cost, which is a tiny part of the provincial budget. A few days later, there was another set of answers. So it's clear that it was canceled for purely ideological purposes. At the same time that the experiment was canceled, the minister announced that she was instructing the Auditor General to investigate hundreds of millions of dollars of welfare fraud. When asked for the evidence on which she was basing that, she couldn't produce any. There's no indication that it actually exists. At the same time, she said that our government believes that the best social policy is a job, and we're going to ensure that these people get one. So it's pretty ideological.
Thank you very much. So we had one completed, two ongoing, one cancelled, and now one planned.
Potential, yes. Hence the fact that my column looks quite empty compared to everyone else's. But you know, it's an exciting time for us in Scotland because we are very much at the feasibility stage of exploring whether indeed we can undertake basic income experiments within Scotland. And as I'll touch on, there's some challenges ahead for us to do with that, but also I think it's a really exciting time to learn from the work that's been taking place elsewhere, to learn from the challenges that have been faced, particularly around media representation and political decisions, and hopefully to be able to build some of those into the design of our own pilots if we can get to that stage. My interest really, I work for an organisation called the RSA, which is an international think tank. We're fascinated by basic income in a number of different ways. It relates a lot to areas of work that we're looking at around the future of work, around the role of the economy and how to make it more inclusive, and actually as a system for starting to change how society interacts, to reset and revitalise the social contract. Basic income is an idea that's become very interesting to us, and something I've been able to play a lot of work in Scotland over the last few years, whether from a perspective of a lot of public speaking around it, or also from engaging with a variety of politicians, decision makers, and carrying out some work around it as well. I think really to look at where we are in Scotland, we can see 3 key events over the last 2 years that have really caused an explosion in activity. So although basic income has been discussed in Scotland for a long time, notable people like Annie Miller from BIEN have been very active proponents of the system, it really hadn't picked up a huge amount of traction within policy spaces. In early 2016, we have an annual lecture for the RSA called the Angus Miller Lecture, and we invited Guy Standing to deliver the lecture that year, which was great. It had a really fantastic turnout, a lot of younger people showing up than we sometimes get at some of our events. But we also hosted a roundtable the day afterwards with some key figures to discuss whether there was indeed any traction for basic income in Scotland. And that gave us an opportunity to tap into some excellent work that had been carried out in Fife, one of our Scottish local authorities just to the north of Edinburgh, who had a process called the Fairer Fife Commission, which had looked at ways of making the authority a fairer place for its citizens. And one of the recommendations had been to carry out a basic income experiment within the town within the area. That really was our starting point. I have to admit, at that stage, for me, it was a useful provocation to challenge some of the issues that we can see in social security and the welfare state in the UK. It wasn't necessarily an idea that I thought we'd be able to get much traction with, but it seemed a really good starting place for some of these conversations. Our next real change was in November of that year, 2016, when we had 2 events. One was the launch of CBIN, Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland, which is now the BIEN affiliate in Scotland, which has really helped to start to galvanise grassroots interest and activism around basic income. But the other event was getting the City of Glasgow to commit to the interest in exploring feasibility of an experiment within the city. Now, Glasgow is Scotland's biggest city. It's a very vibrant city that is doing a lot of things very well, yet also has some incredibly entrenched issues around poverty, around ill health, around worklessness, that have been there for generations and that we've tried to tinker around the edges with. And much as we heard yesterday from Philippe Olsen, there's a growing awareness that actually tinkering around the edges is not going to make a change there. Getting Glasgow on as Scotland's biggest city, combined with obviously the great work from Fife already, suddenly gave us a feeling that something was possible here. There was something starting to grow. And really that culminated last September 2017, when the Scottish Government, in their programme for government, their outlining of key policy priorities, included the commitment to funding of feasibility work around potential experiments in Scotland within that, committing £250,000 towards it. Now, that was a huge step forward because actually for the Scottish Government, and as I'll touch on a little bit just quickly in a second, they don't have the ability to deliver basic income for Scotland under the settlement we have. So actually to have them willing to commit the money to explore this properly is a huge step forward and has allowed us to have 4 local authority areas, Glasgow, Fife, Edinburgh and North Ayrshire, to start to work together. And there's a pilot group, many of whom are here. There's a great Scottish contingent. I urge you to talk to them while they're over, to start to explore those feasibilities. For me, I think that the key drivers for the interest in Scotland are very much from the perspective of social justice, of fairness, and of trying to combat some of the issues we've seen around poverty in Scotland over a very long period of time. We're a small country, we're a very ambitious one, and we're one that can do very well, I think, but actually we've seen these issues sticking there. And this idea of looking at basic income as a revolutionary way to reset that social contract in Scotland really has chimed, I think, with a lot of people. The unique aspect, though, in Scotland that we face that will be very interesting to look at is the nature of devolution in the United Kingdom. We can't currently, as I mentioned, deliver basic income within a Scottish context. We only control about 15% of our social security budget, which has only just recently been introduced, and we lack the full fiscal levers to be able to do that. So basic income is not a policy of the status quo for Scotland. As many of you will know, we had a discussion a very robust and creative discussion in Scotland around our constitutional future. And given some of the current challenges that we face in the UK, I suspect we may have another constitutional discussion in the near future. But certainly, although it's not a policy of the status quo, it's a policy that could be delivered potentially in an independent Scotland, but also in the United Kingdom that looks more towards a federalised setup. So it's a very interesting and provocative space for us to look at, and I think a very exciting time to learn from what's happening elsewhere in the world to help shape that.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Of course, in the case of Scotland, for the reason indicated, there are specific difficulties because of the multi-level sort of governments, also in the field of social policy, which is a problem that was discussed in the case of Spain, and of course one that also arises in the case of Canada. Okay, you've talked a bit more than your 2 or 3 minutes, so you'll be deprived of the next turn. Wait, sensibly, because what I want to ask now is the following. Really, we do these experiments, but don't we all know in advance what these experiments are going to lead to? So what I want to ask to Sarath is if there is one thing that surprised you in the outcomes of the Madhya Pradesh experiment, what was it? And then I'll ask to you three, well, what will you be most curious to know? So what is it that you don't know and you really are anxious to have an answer to a question where you really don't know in advance what it is? If there is one thing you can single out, and so I'll ask also that question to Evelyn in a more sort of counterfactual way. What would you have liked to know and don't know now, which this could have revealed? So we start with Sarath.
Well, I think much of the work normally we do in the villages is to go and make them aware of their rights and all that. But in this experiment, I started this experiment with a lot of skepticism myself. But what was really shocking, and what today my conviction comes from that, is that people have a very clear idea about how they want to get out of their situation. And that change actually happens. I've seen that change gradually happening very imperceptibly. That is what has shocked me, that transformation is possible and you don't need you need to give a model to them.
Olli, so what are you really anxious to know? What will you really be curious when you'll see the results? So,
okay, you started by asking that everybody knows what the results will be. Actually, it's that everybody knows what the results will be. For example, I used to go through all political parties in Finland when we were planning the experiment. And then in a big party, I don't say the name, there was a MP who said that, I know what will happen. You will give 560 euros and everybody will go to work because people want to have something extra. They will have the salary and then 560 euros so that everybody will go to work. And somebody else in the very same party came to me and said that I know what will happen. People will get lazy, nobody will work. So, but we know what will happen. And whatever will happen, they will criticize the experiment. If the experiment shows that everybody finds an employment, in that case that they are opposing basic income, they are saying that yes, but it was a very bland experiment. And in the case that it shows that nobody finds an employment, then the proponents of basic income will say that yes, of course it's so, because it was a very badly planned experiment. So that a short intro. So what will I want to see? I will see everything, and I'm very curious to see what will happen, because honestly speaking, I don't know what will happen. And we have lots of possibilities in this experiment, despite all the problems that we have and limitations that we have. It's a very strong experiment in that sense that it's obligatory, it's a random sampling representing the whole country. And therefore it doesn't have those problems that a local experiment will have, because they will be destroyed if some external shock will hit the municipality. So that we have very strong experiment, and we have a treatment group. It's only 200 people, 2,000 people, but anyway, it's 2,000 people, and we have identical control group. They were totally identical in the beginning of the experiment, and if there are differences in their behavior, in their health status, in this and that, in that case we can conclude causally that the differences are caused by the treatment. So that I'm very anxious to see. There are lots of limitations. I don't know if you will like to hear them. I can tell 2 weeks about them. But and then one more thing is that we will base most of our evaluations on registers, and we have in this country perhaps the best register in the world, so that we can link to that individual who is getting basic income and individual who is in the control group. For example, statistics on the recipients of social security, employment, income from employment, which kind of employment the income is coming, is it self-employment or dependent employment, which kind of medicine they are eating, which kind of diagnosis they are suffering from, etc., etc. And we can follow them during the experiment. We can follow them 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years after the experiment, and we can also follow the children and grandchildren if we want. Yeah. I will be not analyzing the grandchildren, but perhaps children. Let's see. So I'm very curious, as you see.
Yeah. Having a big brother state is very good for people who do experiments, right? You know so much about people.
Yeah, okay. I don't know, but lots of people know what will happen.
Look.
Yeah, for Holland, there is looming in the background that about 6 years ago, in 2012, the port city of Rotterdam, they did already a randomized controlled trial which was inspired by workfare. And they evaluated the results, and they did show that a more workfare-oriented approach does have limited results. So on the short term, they saw a higher outflow because the scheme was really nasty, maybe, for the participants. And although on the long term, the results were much worse. So many of the positive effect in outflow were reduced if you took this long-term perspective. So this randomized control trial results are looming in the background, and I always use the image of a school teacher. Suppose there is a school teacher who wants that her children performs better, and then she can do two things. She can use sanctions and threat and monitoring, or she can use a different approach, paying more attention, better listening, giving more autonomy to the children. And the most curious thing I want to know in this Dutch experiment, inspired by these different behavioral approaches, is that whether this different approach adopted by a school teacher might also work. Not necessarily limited to outflow into paid work, but also into how they experience their contact with caseworkers, etc.
So it may not necessarily be about the labor market behavior of these people, but the other aspect. Okay, Evelyn.
I'm a little bit more cynical than my colleagues for obvious reasons. I love doing experiments. I think it's great fun, but it's great fun in an academic way. I don't think it's possible to design a perfect experiment. I don't think it's possible to design an experiment that's going to convince anybody who's already made up their mind about what the answers are. I actually went into this experiment hoping to have a little bit of fun doing the analysis, but really I had great fear when we began that There might be outcomes that we didn't anticipate, that bad things could happen during the experiment, and I actually had very little hope that we would learn anything I didn't already anticipate. Might have tightened our estimates of some of the outcomes, might have seen how things have changed in recent years, but I think we pretty much know which direction most of the variables move in.
Okay, so that was a pretty sort of pessimistic ending in the series of 4. Now comes a cheeky question, closely related to what you just said, which is there any result coming out of the experiment that would convince you that basic income, after all, is a bad idea? So what would need to come out of the experiment for you to believe that, after all, it's a bad idea? So we start with you, Sarath.
Actually,
Feel the tension in the room about that.
no, when Philippe asked this question and the next question, I was quite puzzled. But the thing is that a pilot, when you take the findings to a politician or a bureaucrat or anywhere else, there's a way in which a pilot study and experiment can be trivialized. Oh, you give extra money, who will not be happy? How will you not get, why will you not get good results? They'll all be happy. You keep giving, they'll be more happier, and they will give you good feedback. So what's the big deal? And you are not replacing it with anything else, so you're not taking away anything. You give me money, I'll give you positive feedback. So what's the big deal about your randomized control trial and all that? So it's trivialized. But we were so innocent that we thought that when we have evidence in our hand, we were idealizing the evidence, and we went and said proudly, look, we have evidence, we have the... So, but I feel that there is something that we have learnt in this, that pure scientific rational evidence alone cannot carry the entire weight of the idea of basic income. There are two other ways, unless those two are in place and we carry the evidence along with it. One is the moral argument, the other is the political arguments. Unless the evidence is taken, evidence it's not enough. It must go along with other things. So if you go only with evidence and say that evidence is there, so let's implement a policy, I don't think it has not worked for us, because people first thing they have is a moral objection. They know why it won't work, and it's a cultural knee-jerk reaction. People say, I know it won't work. Forget about your evidence. You have manufactured evidence.
So, Sarath, I fully agree with what you said, and I'm sure people in the room agreed with what you said. But what sort of results in an experiment could convince you that, after all, basic income is a bad idea?
Nothing. Nothing, and I don't want to think about it.
Okay. That's a clear answer. I think there is something worrying about the clapping. Okay.
Okay. What would prove to me that it's a bad idea? We did lots of microsimulations before we planned the model, and those economic microsimulations showed that basic income as such is not enough to solve all those problems that the Finnish welfare state is suffering from. So that the basic income needs something else. And the something else is, for example, reforming the housing allowance system and reforming very many other aspects also. And in the case that the experiment that we have will show that people are not more satisfied when they are getting this money, they are no more enterprising, they are no happier, their level of well-being is lower than in the control group, and everything goes badly. In that case, I would say that the basic income is a bad thing. But of course, there will be lots of economists and economic calculations that will show that it's not feasible, that our national economy will not tolerate that kind of thing as basic income. And we can perhaps to some extent meet those criticisms, but in this experiment we can't go those kind of philosophical motivations. For example, what you have Philippe wrote about freedom to all, so that this kind of experiments are not the proper tools to deal with the basic questions that we have there. So that we are only dealing with surface when we have this kind of experiments. And that's good to have in mind, that we can only partially answer to those questions that, for example, from your point of view, can be rather marginal.
Okay, Evelyn, so can you spell out what, no, Loek first, Loek, and then, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, wait, in Holland, I do know that many cities, many aldermen, they were inspired by the basic income idea when they said, we as a city want to experiment. But we have also seen that in the end, where we did have a huge uphill battle with the central government, what kind of experiments are permitted. So they did have to write a legal annex into the law that these cities are allowed to deviate from the regular Participation Act. And the point is that now the actual experiments are so compromised that I have moved with the goalpost. So I do not see this anymore as a test on basic income. I see it as an experiment. How can we improve the way we treat the people on welfare? So looming in the background is Rotterdam experiment, a more workfare approach, and then is there a way to do it in a more relaxed way? But yeah, of course, for the basic income support, it would of course be a bad outcome if the exemption group would perform worse. But still, we have the central government, they have imposed some conditions that makes the signal with respect from the point of view of basic income very weak. For instance, we have to contact also the group who do have an exemption after 6 months. What are you doing? And we have to do that, again after a year. Yeah. While all these all these experiments are on the label of trust experiments, but you still do not trust them. And you still have to call them, what are you doing? So I think that all these concessions we have to make has on the one hand the effect that it is not really a basic income experiment, but on the other side, whatever the outcomes, you cannot say in the end it will be detrimental to basic income, because the signal was really very weak.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting because in a way, Sarath and you give the same answer, nothing, but for a very different reason, because you said this is not really basic income. And so in the case of that, Evelyn, if you could then spell out a bit what you started saying, so in direct answer to, is there anything that would convince you that it's a bad idea?
Yeah, there is. I think basic income rests on the premise that if you give grown-up people money, they know how to spend it. I don't think we have a lot of evidence saying when it is people become grown up. And I think that there's quite a lot of evidence out there in the medical literature, for example, arguing that adolescents should be redefined to include people from age 10 to 24. The Ontario experiment, well, not to suggest that there isn't poverty among youth. I mean, that's a serious source of poverty, certainly in Canada. But I would have loved to have actually examined something that nobody's looking at, and that is to have done a 3-arm trial on people aged 18 through 24. you know, one group getting whatever programs are out there now, a second group getting a basic income, and a third group getting a more structured program, perhaps including job training or requirements to participate in certain kinds of activities. And it seems to me that we ought to know at what age a basic income ought to be introduced, at what age individuals, on average, are capable of making rational decisions. And I could be convinced, I teach 18-year-olds, right? I could be convinced that 18 might be a bit young.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Evelyn. That's a challenge to proposals that were defended by some people about the basic income for the young specifically.
I know.
Okay, we like controversies. Okay, Jamie.
Absolutely. Well, I think for me, I'm not an academic, so policy is my area of interest, and I'm interested in basic income because I want to see a way to improve Scotland, to make the country a fairer and better place. So any outcomes from experiments that indicated that's not what basic income was doing would definitely require us to change our direction. But I think more, so for example, I think if we are looking at how this can impact around poverty that we're seeing, if it doesn't seem to help that, or if it requires too many additional measures that perhaps money could be better used elsewhere, that would require a rethink. If it didn't seem to have beneficial impacts on physical and mental well-being, which are huge areas of challenge for us. Now, I wouldn't quite go as far as Sarath to say that there's nothing that would put me off. From what I understand, I would be very surprised that they were outcomes we found. But I think we have to remain open to the challenge that comes within that. I actually think the biggest challenge I see from a policy perspective is the type of basic income that might then be suggested to be implemented. And that's where I could see myself going from advocacy to opposition, which is if we had, and it's not a strong tradition in Scotland, but I think some of the kind of libertarian right approaches to basic income that saw it as a chance to cut the wider welfare state in Scotland would not be something that I would be able to support, even if it still in some ways met the definitions of a basic income. So we're very clear to focus in the work we're doing around social security rather than the wider welfare state, so the National Health Service and education. But you can see that there are trends there, particularly on a UK level, of politics that would like to use opportunities to cut the existing, and already have cut the welfare provision we have. So anything that took the label of basic income but used it in that direction is something that certainly I wouldn't be supportive of.
Next question is also slightly, be tricky. The following. So I have a very vivid memory of a long conversation I had with Jim Tobin, the American economist at Yale in 1998. And Jim Tobin, as many of you know, was the first to write a technical article about a basic income, the variety of a negative income tax, which was then called Demogrant. He helped convince George McGovern, presidential candidate, to put it on his platform, at least at the level of the primaries, and then was one of those who inspired the negative income tax experiments in the US in the 1970s. And what he told me is that when he looked at the main results of the negative income experiments, which he wasn't surprised, and he summarized these results by saying, one, there was statistically significant and clearly causal impact on the labor market participation of secondary earners, so mainly mothers, who reduced their labor market participation, one. And two, in at least one of the experiments, there was an increase in the rate of divorce. And he said none of these two results surprised him, because it was the outcome of, it was one of the results of empowering some of the people, mainly women, who were stuck in a situation of either work or household, which they only accepted because they had no alternative. So he said, I was not surprised, and this corresponded in a way to what I was hoping. But nevertheless, he said, what I was surprised and greatly disappointed by is the political reaction to that, which was a massive backlash, and that as a result of the negative income tax experiments, in fact, the idea of a negative income tax or demo grant was wiped off the agenda for decennia. Indeed, Moynihan, Daniel, the Senator Moynihan, who had been also one of the main inspirers of it, said in the Senate, said science has now spoken and we must abandon that avenue. So my question to you then is, and in a way Evelyn already alluded to that, and perhaps also all the fake news about the interruption of the Finnish experiment is part of that. Isn't there a risk with these experiments that it will do more bad than good because of a backlash it will create? Because, as Olli already alluded to, then some people will sort of really focus on one particular aspect that will be shown very scientifically with control groups and all the rest, and will say that's enough to kill the idea. So do you see that danger? If you see that danger, is there a way of preventing it, even by saying certain things at this stage? So let's start with you, Sarath.
I think I'll just repeat myself that, you know, people when they are have political and moral objections to the very idea, they're not willing to listen to the evidence at all. It's only people who don't have those two objections that they are willing to listen and see, okay, what exactly happens when you do something like this unconditionally. For me, that unconditional is the most radical thing. So, at least in my context, I don't see a major backlash because of an experiment coming. I'm not able to foresee that.
Right, so Olli?
Yeah, of course, that kind of dangers that you refer to, because already now I see in this country that political parties are trying to frame the experiment and also the non-existent results already to some extent framed. Either money for nothing, money for surfing in Bali, etc., etc. So that there's already now a kind of interpretation process going on. What's the hegemonic frame that will be then presented when the results are there? So that the interpretation will be highly a political process, and it will be a political interpretation, whatever our results will be. So that there is that kind of danger. But what is good point with this experiment that is running here in this country, we are now beginning to discuss those basic things that we must have discussed previously on our social security. Who will get what on what term and how much? So that we are somehow discussing those basic questions because of this basic experiment, income experiment. But I'm very much worried about that. What will the interpretation be? Who have the power to frame the question? Is it those who are against the experiment or those who are in favor? And what will be the role of mass media here? So that those mass media things are pretty important, as you said, in the case of the Finnish those fake news stating that the Finnish experiment has Ontario way.
Okay, Loek.
Yeah, what I would recommend for all people who are interested in this challenge to read a book by, it is just being finished by Carl Wiederquist. You have saw him at the beginning. He is also paying a lot of attention to this problem, and indeed one of the challenges is that the results of the experiments are only being communicated in terms of this primary measure of outflow into paid work. So we also see in the Dutch situation that the central government is basically only interested into this primary measure. while we as scientific supervisor of the experiment, also the local aldermen, they want to measure much more broadly. So it might be that the experiments have mixed outcomes, like what happened in the negative income tax experiments. I do remember that the New Jersey negative income tax experiment, they did indeed find that women, secondary earners, they reduced their labor supply from 8 to 6 hours per week on average. But this was the end of the 60s, early 70s, so still the period of the breadwinner family. And these families in the experiment, they did on average have 4 children. So from a society perspective, is this a bad outcome if you have 4 children at home and you can reduce your working time, your paid work, a little bit to spend more time to the children? So it all depends on the framing. While in the US there were headlines, why pay people to work less? So that is one of the dangers that might happen, and that Carl has also addressed in this book, that you must get the full picture of the results, because probably the results will be mixed. And then the spin might be that they will only focus on one aspect.
Evelyn?
Yeah, 2 quick comments. So I'm very conscious of the fact that Rutger Bregman said everybody's bored with Dauphin, but I have to tell you a little story. When MINCOM results were first analyzed by labor market economists, the initial finding was that young unattached males reduced their work participation really dramatically. And when I went back to it a few years later, the same story got told as teenage boys stay in high school just a little bit longer. So it's true, they took their first full-time job at 18 instead of at 16, which reduced the number of hours on average that were worked rather dramatically. So yeah, you can spin data in lots of different ways. But the second story, I want to broaden the kind of issue you raised. One of the things that I've become very, very aware of in the Ontario experiment is that one story just wipes out reams and reams and reams of data. People focus on the story, and the story has meaning for them in a way that no amount of data and no presentation of the data possibly can have. And that can be a very positive thing. I mean, in the Ontario experiment, I've heard many, many times about a young woman who bought her first winter coat at a real store rather than at a thrift shop in the past 20 years. And the journalists love the story, and it goes on and on about what a great success it is. But the other side of that is that there were 6,000 participants in the Ontario experiment. And when you think of any group of 6,000 people, that's the full range of human personality types. And so you're going to get a lot of really rational people who make good decisions, but you're also going to get some people who make really, really bad decisions. It's inevitable. You've got a lot of people there. And so one guy who cashes his check, goes out and buys a gun, comes home and shoots his family, is going to have an impact. It's going to show up in the press, and one way or another, it's going to influence or at least be used by a whole lot of people to talk about what happens when you give people a basic income.
I think there are already various hints about the way in which we should prepare for the coming, for when the results come out, including with good pictures and good stories that are illustrative of real facts. It should not conflict with the actual evidence, but it should illustrate the positive sides in a powerful way.
Yeah,
Jamie.
I mean, I think there's a lot of good points there already, and I particularly agree with Evelyn's point there. But stories can be very powerfully good and very powerfully negative as well. I think 2 things I would add from certainly a Scottish perspective. One is I think there's a danger around confusion of the terms used that can backfire. So, for example, we have huge issues in the United Kingdom just now with the universal credit system, which is an absolute disaster and a monstrosity, yet people get it confused because it's a similar sounding term. And I think we're seeing more of that because as we raise the profile of basic income, people are tying ideas on the back of it because that gets media coverage, and there becomes a confusion that needs to be dealt with. I think the other challenge we face in Scotland is very much about keeping this as a policy that's been driven by wider civic society in Scotland rather than by political parties. We don't want this to get caught up purely into the constitutional divide, because you then have opposition purely on the basis of where people stand on independence, which doesn't have to be the case with this. And I think the way that we respond to those is partly by being prepared and being very upfront about what we expect to get out of the experiments. One of the critiques we have thrown at us quite a lot in the UK just now, particularly from the kind of soft left in England, is the idea that basic income won't solve every problem, so therefore it's not worth doing. Now, no policy in the history of the world ever has or ever will solve every problem. It's a unjust and unrealistic critique. But we need to ensure that as advocates, we're also being clear that that's not a claim we're making. We know it won't solve everything. It's a foundation that we build others on top of. And I think the other thing is ensuring the continuing strong role for civic society, for communities, for academics in Scotland, to allow the local authorities, the politicians, the Scottish Government, to play a role of facilitating and enabling the pilots, but actually the driving for that coming from real communities themselves, because I think that allows us to get the proper human interaction into us that stops it getting caught up in the kind of ideological decisions that we've seen undermine the work in Ontario and elsewhere.
Okay, so we'll take now questions from the floor, and so there's a microphone, perhaps two microphones.
You don't need one.
Do we take 3 questions?
I would like to stress the question from, Helmo Pape from Austria, Vienna, activist. And I would like to ask the panel if there is any fear of the disruption of social cohesion or the solidarity in a society tied to how to finance a basic income. To give you a hint of what I'm thinking of is if you stress heavily the negative income tax, which is, as far as I know, a favorite way of funding it, you would segregate the society into those who pay into this scheme and those, especially if it's a sufficient basic income, those who get it, and that would, in my opinion, be a sting in society and oppose social cohesion. Do you share this opinion?
Yeah. Oh.
Then where is the other microphone? Over there. You first.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks so much for your. Thanks so much for your reflections. My question is for Sarath. Elise Klein, University of Melbourne. Sarath, I'm just so curious about this legacy survey, and particularly what results came from it after the trial. And for the other panellists, and related to that question, is what measures do you put in place when these experiments end? And how do you prepare people from going from having the payment to nothing? Yeah, thanks.
So this was a question addressed to the audience. Okay. Next question there. Yeah.
Raimund Acker from Network in Germany. On the panel, it was I heard a concern that people with basic income could make bad decisions. Now, if I'm right, basic income is not so much about money, but about freedom. So I would like to hear if do you think that more people making bad decisions is a success in terms of more freedom?
We take these 3 questions for the next round. Okay, so Sarath on the Indian question, Evelyn on the paternalism question, if I can, and then anyone who wants to reply to the social cohesion. Okay, Sarath.
Well, how did we prepare people? I think right in the beginning, we made it very clear that it is going to be for this period. In fact, after 12 months, we extended it to 5 more months, and that was the period everybody knew that it's going to end. Though, when I look back, I feel very strongly that the duration, definitely, if I were to do it now, I would definitely go at least give 3 years to 5 years. That is the minimum, because you are actually being very ambitious to see quite a lot of changes, and when the change process begins and you snap out of it. So that was really the tragic part of the experiment. So, but then those are the limitations within which we work. Now, on just one small thing I want to say about this. My ideal basic income would be to give to entire 1.3 billion population, high enough, and then find ways of excluding people or taking it back through the taxation, whatever. But then in India, we have like poverty is the elephant sitting in the drawing room, so we cannot afford to foreclose the debate by talking about that. So nobody wants to listen to that.
I'm not a philosopher. I'm prepared to bet that most people would think shooting your family is a bad thing. Perhaps I shouldn't have used the word bad. I will say there are people who will make some decisions that will reflect badly on the experiment in terms of what the norms of the society you're living in are. I'm not prepared to talk about what people should be spending their money on or anything like that, or whether they should be working or not working. I'm not talking about financial decisions. I'm talking about socially destructive decisions.
All of them. So when it comes to the patronizing question, in this country, funnily enough, we have one party who is very liberal-minded in their party program, and they want to abolish all kind of patronizing thing when it comes to economic activities, so that enterprises must have freedom to move and do things without any limitations, dealing with the environment, environmental regulations whatsoever. But on the other hand, they have no problem whatsoever to limit freedom of people to make their own choices, so that they are very patronizing. So that it depends how or which kind of picture we have on people. And then the problem of solidarity. To some extent, I think that the movement to basic income in this country, in Finland, wouldn't be that big an issue, because we have universal child allowances, we have universal grants for students, we have universal pensions, and actually we do have almost universal unemployment benefit that's payable for everybody, that's payable forever. So that it wouldn't be that big an issue, and then the financing wouldn't be that big a deal. But what I think that in the case that which kind of basic income would be feasible, or the most easy to carry out in this country, would unify somehow basic income and then some kind of employment or work condition, so that you will get something, but such that's enough for you to exist. And then if you want to have something more, then you must show some participation, because work ethic in this country is pretty strong. And there are only two parties, rather small parties, the Greens and the left-wing party, who are totally in favor of basic income, but the other parties are more or less against it. And why they are against it is just because they want to have some conditionalities and employment, that people must have some employment on top of that. So that would be something that wouldn't erode social solidarity in this country.
Some good questions there, and I think certainly within the design stage in Scotland, that tapering off period is going to be a critical part to look at, because obviously we don't want to cause any harm to anyone who's participating. I think it's crucial. But just come to the social cohesion question, because I think that's really important. For me, this is where, in a sense, the unconditionality is critical. I think that's the biggest change we would see. But in terms of delivering this as a national policy, universality is how we do that successfully. In the UK, traditionally, our social provisions that are universal, so the NHS, education, traditionally child benefit, are those that have retained the longest support, even from people who don't necessarily use them. Whereas benefits that have become more targeted, so housing benefits, are very quickly targets within the media for politicians to be cut. And that's where the disconnect comes. So I think as a national policy, this would very much be, as Sarath was saying, something that everybody would have. There's an important symbolic gesture to receiving this as a reminder that we are all citizens, whether we need it or not. It's a very small example, but my employer, in my paycheck every month, there's a line that says my well-being payment. And it's a tiny sum of money. I can honestly say I've probably never used it directly for my well-being, but every so often I look at my paycheck and it's a reminder that my organisation wants me to look after myself. I think there's an important reminder to that our basic income payment coming through that reminds everybody that we're part of this interactive society. And so to me, the fear is not about causing a lack of cohesion, but actually that this will give us a stronger cohesion overall.
Take the last round of questions. So Wolfgang asked a question, but we have to correct a little bit the gender balance, which is not too good here on the. So absolute priority to ladies. So there was one there, there's one there, then if there is no more ladies, we can ask a gentleman. So two ladies and then okay, but we start with Wolfgang. Well, no, we'll start with you and then.
Hi, my name is Sarah Trigaboff. I'm a graduate student at Cornell University. Thank you for sharing your experiences. Given the current political climate in the United States and the tenor of conversation around immigration and citizenship rights, I'm curious if you've had experience in your pilots navigating not the conditions of in terms of work conditions or anything like that of receiving it, but like the citizenship aspect in terms of who within national borders would actually be eligible to receive it, and if you did have tensions, how you navigated those.
Right. Next, who has the microphone? Microphone here to him. But yeah, you. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Chian Choi. I'm from South Korea. Thank you for sharing your reflections. And I was looking into the ways to implement basic income through legalization in Korea. And before the law comes, there should be the policy, and before the policy, there should be the public consensus and the public support that should come in. And in Korea, I don't think that's the stage yet, but in my view, that the major obstacles against the public consensus would be probably two things. One is, well, the public consensus is intertwined with the public resistance on the funding issues as well. And whenever they hear that they somehow has to raise taxes to fund those basic income, they would freak out, and they are suddenly just against everything about basic income at all. So I was wondering if, well, without solving these issues, you cannot really go into the way to the legal implementation, which is really the final stage of getting the basic income into their stone in the legal way. So I was wondering, what's your insights as to like solving those issues and concretely forming the public consensus on basic income against the restrictions on the fundings as well?
And you think that experiments could help in facing this? Yes. Okay. Then question there.
Okay, so I am Marc de Basquiat from France. Thank you very much for all your discussion, very interesting. I will give you my feeling. My feeling is that experiments is a way that politicians invent to put us on the corner. It's a very easy way to say, oh, just show us, and then in 10 years' time, we discuss that again. We had a very interesting report done by the Senate in France in 2016. And these guys wanted to say, hey, we need to experiment this first. Although they were quite interesting about what the idea. They were very positive and say, no, experiment first. And this maybe will last 10, 15, 20 years where we just start to experiment and we do not have any reform. This is my fear.
Yep. Wolfgang Strengmann-Kuhn. I'm economist and member of the German Parliament. I have two short questions to Olli Kangas. The first is when will the results be available from the experiment? And the other question is next year you have elections in Finland, and I hope that after that basic income will be introduced in Finland, but I'm not so sure. So maybe there will be a discussion to run another pilot experiment. Do you have any proposals for a different design for a new experiment?
Okay, let's start with this question, which is the most specific for you.
Yeah, if I also react on that citizenship question, because just to make short story long, when we started to plan this experiment, the minister who was responsible for this experiment, she was coming from true Finns. That body, how to say it beautifully, they're a little bit skeptical against immigration. Somebody would say that they're xenophobic, but I wouldn't use that word. And the most important thing for her in the first discussions was that this experiment is improving the image of the country so that all refugees from Iraq will come to Finland. When they are here, they will call their cousins in Lebanon and say, come, this is a silly country, but they are giving free money for everybody, come. And I had very serious and long discussions dealing with this issue. With her and with her party and with the parliament and with the government. And the tricky thing here in this country is that social security is not based on citizenship, but it's based on residency. And nothing wouldn't be changed that much if we have basic income or if we have this system that we have now. So that it was more or less artificial and political discussion that was somehow coming out from the affairs that this experiment will improve the country or be a kind of magnet that people will move in the country. And then the more specific questions. Oh, then there was a question about putting things in the corner. I think that in the very beginning, at least, I said that I don't name any political parties, but I name now. When the Centre Party took this issue to the governmental program, they were very eager and they were honest and they wanted to try. Whereas the Conservatives were against and true Finns had reservations. So that at least among the Centre Parties, it was a true thing to try and to try to see if this is something. And they were very eager in the very beginning, and they were even so eager that they wanted to implement it during this mandate period that is there. But it was too a big issue to be implemented in 4 years. Then results available. We are now planning the evaluation and evaluations. And as I said, that very much is based on registers. And the problem is that registers are lagging behind in this country, so that the reliable income registers on 2017 will be in our hands in the end of this year. So that we will have preliminary data on 10, but it's only for the first year. And then in the end of 2019, we will have a complete database. And after the elections, yes. And we are very much planning that that data will be available for everybody, so that if you are interested in analyzing that data, it's possible to do. And then we have some plans to carry out a survey in the end of this year, so that there will be survey data that deals with well-being, health, and all wider aspects than that employment aspect. And that will be available in the end of this year or in the beginning of next year. And also when the first results, or when the first analyses are done, then we have a plan to put in the scientific database that is housed here in Tampere, so that also that data will be available for everybody, hopefully.
Yeah. So this open access is very good. Of course, it will come very late.
Yeah, but of course it will come late, because when the experiment had been running 3 months, then the secretary of the state, she called me and said that we are now discussing next year's budget. Will you come and tell the results? And I said that, well, I could come, but it's very short, the speech.
Okay, is there someone in particular who wants to react to the Korean question? Yeah, Jamie?
Thanks, yeah. I think sometimes, and I know it changes in different national contexts, but I think sometimes we've allowed ourselves to be scared off talking about taxation. We've accepted this story that nobody will accept tax rises. And actually, I think certainly within a Scottish and UK context, what we've seen is that where there's a clear purpose to those, they can pick up public support. So early on in the Labour government that came in after 1997, there was a decision to raise national insurance payments by a penny, which was directly to pay for the National Health Service. And it was a very well received, directly linked use of public money. Recently in Scotland, the decision was made for the first time under Scotland's tax varying powers to not pass on effectively a tax cut to higher earners in Scotland. Again, broadly was very, it has a minimal difference, but broadly very well received. So I think with basic income for us, it's about connecting it to the impact that this will have. Showing that there's a purpose. This isn't tax rises for the sake of it, but this is for a direct purpose to use. I also think it's about a lot of our discussions with basic income are because we're looking to a new world, a new economy, a new system. We also therefore need to think about taxation differently. So yes, we look at fair and redistributive income tax, but we also need to look at taxes on resources such as data. We need to look at wealth taxation. We need to look at environmental taxation, land value taxation. We need to broaden out the discussion, and I think if we can do that and involve the public in that, it changes it from being seen as purely a punitive, we're going to charge you more, to a very positive social coherence around how we deliver those policies.
So if you want to react to any of the questions, just pick the question you want to react.
Not to any specific question, but I just want 2 things to share before I lose my chance. I mean, I think we should put this evidence-based policy making in its historical perspective. I feel very strongly that it is of recent origin. I don't think when we wanted to abolish slavery, we said, let's have some pilots and see, or give adult franchise, we said, let's have and see if it's a good idea or not. So the point is that always, when I say I can't talk about basic income in a situation where some other discussion is happening. I have to stitch it into what exactly is the discussion locally happening, and within that, how do I fit this in its own way. So we should accept the diversity of our all starting points. We are all coming from very different contexts, and we are starting with small little things which we are calling basic income, but I think there may be a disagreement on that. The second point is that I'm a trained social scientist, so I see the value. The most important value of an experiment is that it gives me an opportunity to open conversations in different contexts. It's really not about the linear way of this policy, everything will be all right. No. I think what basic income stands for, in fact, I was enlightened about this point by a bureaucrat. He said that it's not about this monetary policy, but you're saying something, you're doing something else. So what is it that we are testing when we are testing in an experiment? We are testing whether unconditional is good or not. We are testing whether non-targeting is good or not. We are testing whether individual entitlement is good or not. I feel this is what we are testing, and whether it is good idea to trust people or not. So I think if we abstract it out and go to the underlying values and see this, it takes time before this change will happen. I think then we won't break our hearts every month. If you put all our eggs in one basket of policy, I want to bring about a change tomorrow, next year, next election, I think we will develop serious health problems.
Look.
Yeah, wait, what I think is very important is to put the results of the experiments for Holland. It will be February 2020. February 2020, I expect to deliver the reports, but to put these results, to synthesize them with the outcomes of general equilibrium model that were presented here at the conference, these static models, this back of the envelope approaches with other empirical research to the behavior of lottery winners, and the challenge is a bit to synthesize all these different results, and every approach has a different shortcoming. And the basic income experiment, even if you would be allowed to set up an ideal experiment, will also have serious shortcomings. One of the most important one is that the people in the experiment, they still behave in an economy which is not a basic income economy. So all these community and market effects will not happen. So even if you have a perfect experiment, you will not find the decisive answers. So, the other point I want to stress, that there is still room for other type of experiments among the freelancers, the families with young children. You would expect a huge behavioral response for them if they are given a basic income for a trial period. No.
Evelyn, in particular, Mark's question, because in a way the MINCOM experiment was a typical example of the danger he mentioned, which is that the experiment is started, and by the end of the experiment no one is interested and the thing is completely forgotten, to the point that no one bothers to do the analysis. So is there a serious danger of that sort all over?
I think there's a very serious danger of that. One of the fears when the Ontario project started with a 3-year term, and then you're probably looking at 2 more years to get the analysis out after that, was how you can keep people focused on the need for a basic income for 5 years when there's a certain amount of political support in the population. You know, things happen, all kinds of things happen in a 5-year period. So I think that's entirely true. I don't want to be cynical. I don't think that politicians necessarily choose to support experiments for that purpose, but I think there's a real fear that it will have that effect. And some certainly do. I mean, it is easier to do an experiment than to think about policy in a real way.
Then I think Olli wanted to add a little something that will be the last words from our panel.
Okay, so I forgot to say something about the continuation. I don't think so that this government will do nothing. They will not implement, they don't have time to do that, and the next government will not implement basic income, and very much depends which kind of government we will have. Because at least the conservatives or the social democrats, that most probably will be, one of them will be the Prime Minister party. They are more or less against basic income. so that then depending on the composition of the coalition cabinet, it depends if it's done or not. And then if we have recommendations on continuation, yes, we do have. We have in our final report that we gave to the government, we have lots of different kind of experiments that we are recommending that we could expand the scope of the people, not only be unemployed people, but all kind of people, to be longer experiments and to have more people included. But then one final thing is that today, was it Carl who criticized those experiments that they are isolated from each other. I think that we should somehow try to collaborate, and we have had some discussions with our Dutch colleagues that we will have same questions, and then we can at least to some extent compare what's happening there and what's happening here. And there are lots of other possibilities for us to collaborate. So that because in each experiment we are looking at the basic income, or kind of basic income, from a different angle. And we will get a little bit different answers to a little bit different questions. But if we put them together, I think that we could somehow get something more out of this, what we are doing here.
That's, I think, one of the purposes which is central to BIEN, which is really to connect people across borders in this way. So many of us came all the way to Finland to have a really competent update on what's happening here. We heard that it's somewhat sobering, the news, but it's better to have a news that is correct and not too positive than information that is wrong, because our own action will be more effective if we are well informed.